There are worlds within this galaxy where children are taught to strip down and reassemble a lasgun before they even learn to read. Worlds where the distant thud of artillery becomes a soothing lullaby, and the deep tremor of orbital bombardment feels like the rhythmic pulse of some sleeping, colossal giant. Cadia was precisely such a world, a formidable fortress hewn from ancient stone and unwavering hatred. It stood sentinel at the very mouth of hell itself. Every soul born beneath its perpetually violet skies understood that death was not a mere possibility, but an absolute certainty. The only lingering question was how long they could possibly delay its inevitable arrival. In the harrowing final days before that defiant world was rent asunder, outposts lay scattered across the galaxy like precious seeds cast from a dying tree. These were the desolate places where Cadian regiments maintained forgotten positions, commanded by officers who themselves had long been forgotten by history. Remote stations where the relentless war against chaos raged on in silent obscurity, fought by soldiers who had never known peace and who were destined never to witness it. One such isolated outpost was designated Ters 77 Alpha, a critical communications relay deeply buried within the frozen wastes of Coloss Prime, a desolate, dead world located on the outermost rim of Imperial space. The facility itself was entirely unremarkable, a utilitarian structure of reinforced concrete and ceramite, engineered to withstand even nuclear bombardment, and equipped with powerful Vox arrays capable of punching signals through the most turbulent warp storms plaguing the sector. Its true significance, however, lay not in its strategic value, but in the steadfast men and women who defended it with their lives. The 47th Cadian Shock Troops had been deployed to Ters 77 Alpha 3 years prior to the catastrophic destruction of their home world. They were but 43 soldiers, all that remained from a regiment that had once numbered in the thousands. These were the hardened remnants of brutal campaigns fought on worlds whose names had long since been expunged from Imperial records, veterans of sieges that had stretched for decades and desperate retreats that had spanned entire solar systems. They had been stationed at this remote relay because High Command, in its detached wisdom, believed them to be spent, used up, suitable only for quiet garrison duty on a world where, ostensibly, nothing ever happened. High Command, as it so often was gravely mistaken. The squad leader was a woman named Caso Verin. She had been born and raised in the shadow of the Cadian Gate, within a hab block that constantly vibrated with the thunderous roar of void shields whenever the despoilers' fleets dared to test the system's formidable defenses. Her first memory was the metallic taste of recaf mixed with the acrid fumes of promethium. Her second was the surprisingly heavy weight of a lasgun in her 6-year-old hands. By the time she celebrated her 13th birthday, she could field strip, clean, and reassemble the weapon blindfolded in under 2 minutes. This feat was not considered exceptional. On Cadia, it was simply the expected standard. Verin possessed striking violet eyes, not the pale, ethereal lavender that sometimes marked Cadia's populace as touched by the warp's sinister proximity, but a deep, intense purple shot through with sharp flecks of silver. These were eyes that had witnessed the dramatic birth and violent death of stars through the scope of a long lass, eyes that had watched friends perish with the same unflinching expression they might wear while calmly checking ammunition counts. When she smiled, which was a rare occurrence, it never quite reached those eyes. They remained perpetually fixed on some distant, unseen horizon, where countless enemies waited in numbers too vast to even fathom. Her second in command was Sergeant Jorik Thane, a man whose skin was etched with the ritual scars of the Cadian Youth Corps. Raised within the rigorous Kazagalan military academies, he had been trained from birth to serve as an officer in the Imperium's endless war. The intricate scars adorning his forearms told the silent story of his arduous progression through the ranks. Each mark represented a test passed, a skill meticulously mastered, a profound weakness brutally overcome. The deepest scar, running from his left wrist to his elbow, had been earned during the infamous trial of Iron Resolve, For a grueling 72 hours, he had been buried alive in a coffin barely large enough to contain his body. Food and water were provided through a narrow tube, waste meticulously removed through another. The true purpose of the test was not physical endurance, but unwavering mental fortitude. Many candidates broke within the first day, screaming hysterically to be released. Hain emerged after 3 days, his sanity entirely intact and his faith in the Emperor unshaken. The rest of the squad comprised a diverse cross-section of Cadian society, each member a testament to their home world's brutal demands. There was Ma Corvin, a former factory worker from the industrial zones who possessed an uncanny ability to repair any piece of Imperial technology, with little more than a sturdy wrench and a string of choice profanities. Beside her stood Marcus Dane, a farm boy from the agricultural districts who had learned to shoot with deadly precision by hunting the mutant vermin that relentlessly plagued the towering grain silos. His aim was nothing short of supernatural. In his hands, a standard-issue lasgun transformed into a precision instrument, capable of placing shots through minuscule gaps measured in mere centimeters at distances far exceeding regulation maximums. They were joined by Petra Voss, a former White Shield who had earned her coveted place among the regulars during the harrowing siege of Tyrock Fields. She had been a mere 14 when the Chaos Space Marines of the Iron Warriors breached the outer defenses. While veteran guardsmen fell back in an ordered tactical retreat, Voss had defiantly remained at her post, relentlessly feeding ammunition to a heavy bolter crew that was being systematically eliminated by enemy snipers. When the last gunner fell, she had calmly taken control of the weapon herself. For 6 agonizing hours, she single-handedly held a corridor that should have been defended by a full platoon. Her only companions were the dead and the unwavering voice of the Emperor speaking directly in her heart. The medic was a quiet, introspective man named Felix Harrow. Before the war had irrevocably claimed him, he had been studying to become a physician on one of Cadia's civilian stations, dreaming of a life dedicated to healing. The chaotic incursions had ended those dreams abruptly, brutally. His comprehensive medical training proved far more valuable on the blood-soaked battlefield than in any sterile hospital. Harrow could perform intricate surgery with artillery shells exploding directly overhead, his hands remaining steady as stone. He had saved countless lives in conditions that would have utterly confounded the most seasoned chirurgeons of the official Imperial Medici. His success rate was remarkable, not solely because of his exceptional skill, but because he understood something that many medics never learned. Sometimes the greatest mercy lay in knowing precisely when to let go. These were the soldiers who held Ters 77 Alpha, men and women forged in the relentless fires of the Long War, their spirits tempered by losses that would have shattered lesser souls. They maintained their equipment with a devotion bordering on the religious and performed their arduous duties with mechanical, unwavering precision. Every morning they conducted equipment inspections that would have satisfied even the most fastidious tech priest. Every evening they gathered for solemn prayers that honored not only the Emperor, but also the fallen comrades whose names were meticulously inscribed on the walls of their stark barracks. The relay station itself was a brutal monument to Imperial engineering philosophy. Built to endure for millennia, it resembled a tomb more than it did a communications facility. The main structure was sunk a full 40 meters into the bedrock, surrounded by formidable defensive positions, capable of withstanding direct hits from orbital bombardments. The communications array rose majestically from the center, like the spire of a grim cathedral, its powerful transmitters capable of punching signals through even the most violent warp storms. Power was provided by a geothermal tap that drew raw energy directly from the planet's molten core. Water came from deep ice mines dug into the polar deposits. Food was grimly supplied by automated dropships that arrived every 6 months, laden with crates of corpse starch and protein bars that tasted like cardboard soaked in promethium. Life at the relay followed rigid patterns established by Cadian military doctrine and further refined by 3 years of crushing isolation. Reveille at 0500 hours was followed by physical training so intense it would have challenged even Space Marine neophytes. Equipment maintenance occupied the morning hours, with each soldier meticulously responsible for their personal weapons and a specific portion of the station's complex defensive systems. The afternoon was dedicated to relentless patrol duties, with teams of 2 or 3 soldiers conducting extensive sweeps of the perimeter that extended 15 kilometers from the main facility. The evenings, however, belonged to education and solemn remembrance. Verin conducted tactical seminars where the squad studied historical battles and rigorously analyzed enemy weaknesses. Thane led profound discussions of Imperial doctrine, ensuring that every soldier understood not just what they were fighting for, but why the fight truly mattered. Harrow provided advanced medical training that went far beyond basic field surgery. In the event of total communications failure, each member of the squad would be capable of treating injuries that would normally necessitate hospitalization. But it was the remembrance ceremonies that truly defined life at Ters 77 Alpha. Every single night, the squad gathered in the common room to recite the names of their fallen comrades. The list was long, and it grew longer with each passing year. It began with friends lost during their very first deployment to the agri-world of Coloss Prime, where savage orc raiders had transformed fertile farmland into a charnel house. It continued through the brutal urban warfare on Hive World Morax, where they had battled insidious chaos cultists in labyrinthine tunnels filled with toxic gas and the chilling screams of the damned. The names accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, a profound loss that formed the very foundation of their identity. They were Cadian. They endured. The first ominous sign that their isolation was drawing to a close came on a quiet Tuesday morning during the 3rd year of their deployment. Voss was conducting a routine patrol of Sector 7 when her Vox unit suddenly crackled to life with an automated distress signal. The transmission was brief and heavily corrupted by interference, yet the message was utterly unmistakable. An Imperial vessel was requesting emergency assistance, approximately 200 kilometers to the northwest. The signal repeated every 30 seconds, grimly suggesting that the ship's crew was either dead or completely incapacitated. Verin made the swift decision to investigate without consulting higher command. This was partly due to strict Imperial doctrine, which mandated that all available forces assist in rescue operations, but it was also a stark recognition of reality. The nearest Imperial base was a grueling 6 months away by conventional transport. If there were any survivors aboard the downed vessel, they would surely be dead long before reinforcements could ever arrive. The 47th Cadian Shock Troops were quite simply the only help available. The arduous journey to the crash site took 2 days across treacherous terrain that would have challenged even the most experienced mountaineer. Coloss Prime was a world of environmental extremes. During the day, temperatures could soar to levels that would cook unprotected flesh in mere minutes. At night, they plummeted to depths that could freeze human blood solid in veins. The squad traveled strategically during the dawn and dusk hours when the temperature was merely hostile rather than outright lethal. They moved in a standard patrol formation, with Dane and Voss serving as advanced scouts while the main body followed at a distance of 500 meters. The crashed vessel revealed itself gradually, like a bloated corpse slowly emerging from shallow water. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a dark smudge against the distant horizon. As they drew closer, the indistinct details resolved into a horrifying picture of catastrophic destruction. The ship had once been a light cruiser of ancient design, its mighty hull bearing the deep, gouging scars of weapons fire that had utterly penetrated its void shields and thick armor plating. The impact had driven the immense vessel nearly 100 meters into the planet's surface, creating a massive crater that resembled nothing so much as a meteor strike. Emergency beacons were still stubbornly functioning, powered by backup generators that could continue operating for weeks without maintenance, but there was no response to Vox communications, no discernible signs of life among the twisted, broken wreckage. Verin ordered a careful approach, weapons raised and eyes meticulously scanning for any indication of survivors or perhaps lurking threats. What they discovered instead was something far, far worse than death. The ship's crew had not perished in the crash. They had been changed. The bodies, strewn throughout the wreckage, showed grotesque signs of mutation that could only have stemmed from prolonged, intimate exposure to the insidious influence of chaos. Some had grown additional limbs that terminated in razor-sharp claws or pulsating tentacles. Others had developed bizarre sensory organs in impossible places, eyes sprouting from shoulders or gaping mouths opening directly in the center of chest cavities. The horrifying changes followed no rational pattern, as if reality itself had become fluid and malleable around the vessel, bending to some unseen will. In the captain's quarters, they found a logbook that chillingly recounted the story of the ship's final, ill-fated voyage. The vessel had been traveling through the treacherous maelstrom, carrying a cargo manifest that had been classified at the highest levels of Imperial security. 3 weeks into the perilous journey, the ship had encountered warp storms of unprecedented severity. The Geller field had flickered, allowing the merest, most insidious touch of the Imperium to caress the vessel's hull. That fleeting touch, it turned out, had been enough. The mutations had begun subtly, slowly. A crewman reported strange, vivid dreams. Another complained of disembodied voices whispering in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. Within days, the horrifying changes had become physical. Skin began to shift and flow like viscous water. Bones reformed themselves into grotesque, new configurations. The ship's desperate commander had tried to maintain order, but how does one discipline crew members who no longer possess human vocal cords? The final entry in the logbook was a single, trembling line, written in a hand that shook with either madness or sheer terror. The Emperor protects. But from what? Harrow examined the mutated bodies with the clinical, practiced detachment of a highly trained medic. His conclusion was chillingly unambiguous. The mutations were not random acts of biological chaos, but followed specific patterns that strongly suggested intelligent design. Something malevolent had been reshaping these people according to a plan that human minds simply could not comprehend. The nightmarish process had been ongoing for months, perhaps even years, before the crash. The vessel had become a perverse laboratory where the fundamental laws of biology were being rewritten according to the whims of entities that existed far beyond the boundaries of human sanity. Even more disturbing was his secondary finding. The mutations were still active. Despite the fact that the crew had been dead for weeks, their bodies continued to change. Flesh rippled with unnatural motion that had nothing to do with decomposition. New, hideous growths emerged from corpses that should have long since been reduced to bone and dry tissue. Whatever malevolent force had claimed the ship remained present, working its insidious will upon matter that no longer possessed the spark of life. Verin immediately ordered a full withdrawal. The ship and its corrupted cargo were beyond any hope of salvation. The only conceivable course of action was to return to the relay station and report their horrifying findings to higher command. With a sliver of desperate luck, an Inquisition team might be dispatched to contain the virulent corruption before it could spread beyond the crash site. Such hope, however, proved to be tragically optimistic. The corruption had already found them. Dane was the first to show the insidious symptoms. During the arduous journey back to Ters 77 Alpha, he began complaining of debilitating headaches that seemed to originate from deep behind his eyes. The pain was accompanied by unsettling visual disturbances that he described as seeing things that weren't there. Fleeting shapes moving at the periphery of his vision, shadows that fell in directions defying the position of the sun, and colors that had no names in any human language. Harrow administered standard painkillers and ordered additional rest periods, but the symptoms persisted, growing more severe. By the time they reached the relative safety of the relay station, Dane was reporting auditory hallucinations, voices calling his name from empty corridors, phantom music that seemed to emanate from inside his very skull, and whispers in languages that sounded almost familiar but carried meanings that made his soul ache with a longing for things he could not identify or understand. The subsequent medical examination revealed nothing overtly abnormal. Dane's vital signs were stable, his reflexes remained sharp, and blood tests showed no indication of infection or toxicity. Yet, something was undeniably and profoundly wrong. The man who had once been capable of threading bullets through the eyes of needles now struggled desperately to hit targets at point-blank range. His legendary marksmanship, honed through decades of constant, brutal practice, had mysteriously abandoned him without explanation. Verin made the difficult decision to quarantine Dane in the station's medical bay. This was a precaution born of hard-won experience rather than mere protocol. The 47th Cadian Shock Troops had encountered chaos corruption before. They understood that the enemy's greatest weapon was not overwhelming firepower or numerical superiority, but rather its insidious ability to turn humanity's own strengths against itself. A single corrupted individual could destroy a regiment far more effectively than an entire company of Space Marines. But quarantine measures proved utterly inadequate when the corruption manifested not in flesh, but in perception itself. On the third night after their return, Corvin reported strange equipment malfunctions in the communications array. Routine diagnostic procedures revealed absolutely nothing wrong with the hardware. Yet the transmitters continued to emit signals that bore no resemblance whatsoever to standard Imperial codes. The emissions were complex, intricate patterns of static that seemed to contain hidden meanings, like cryptic messages encoded in the language of dying stars. Technical analysis provided no answers. The equipment functioned perfectly according to every test Corvin could devise. Power consumption remained within normal parameters. Signal strength was optimal. Yet, the very nature of the transmissions had changed in ways that defied all rational explanation. Instead of the crisp digital signals required for interstellar communication, the array was broadcasting analog patterns that resembled nothing so much as the electroencephalographic readings of a dreaming mind. Verin ordered the communications array to be shut down immediately until the malfunction could be identified and thoroughly corrected. This decision, as it turned out, proved to be a grave mistake. Without the constant, familiar background hum of the transmitters, the silence at Ters 77 Alpha became absolute, profound. In that unnerving silence, they began to hear things that simply should not have existed. The sounds came predominantly at night, when the station's environmental systems reduced their activity to conserve precious power. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors, conversations murmured in rooms that had been unoccupied for hours, and the whisper of pages turning in books that contained no words. These auditory phenomena were not random. They followed unsettling patterns that strongly suggested a malevolent purpose. They seemed to be searching for something, methodically exploring every corner of the vast facility, like an invisible, malevolent presence conducting a thorough, methodical inspection. Thane volunteered to investigate. As second-in-command, he considered it his solemn duty to confront threats that might be beyond the capability of his subordinates. Armed with a handheld auspex and a compact las pistol, he began conducting nocturnal patrols of the station's interior spaces. The readings he collected were disturbing, but ultimately inconclusive. The auspex detected motion in areas where nothing visible stirred. Unexplained temperature fluctuations occurred without any apparent cause. Electromagnetic fields shifted according to bizarre patterns that bore no relationship to the station's regular electrical systems. More troubling, however, were the personal effects he discovered during these eerie investigations. Items that belonged to crew members who had died years earlier inexplicably appeared in places where they could not logically exist. A watch that had been solemnly buried with its owner on the battlefields of Morax was found ticking softly on a table in the common room. A heartfelt letter from a sweetheart killed during the orc invasion of Coloss Prime materialized in Tyne's own quarters, written in handwriting he instantly recognized, despite the utter impossibility of its existence. These disturbing manifestations were not mere hallucinations. Other squad members could see and physically touch the displaced objects. They possessed discernible weight and substance, obeying the laws of physics in every measurable way. Yet their very presence violated causality itself. How could items destroyed or buried on distant worlds inexplicably appear inside a sealed facility on Coloss Prime? The question had no rational answer, which horrifyingly suggested that rationality itself might no longer apply. Harrow, ever the pragmatist, proposed a medical explanation. Prolonged exposure to the chaos-tainted wreckage had, he theorized, triggered latent psychic abilities in one or more squad members. The human mind possessed depths that Imperial science had never fully mapped. Under extreme stress, some individuals developed the terrifying capacity to manipulate reality through unconscious psionic activity. The displaced objects, then, were not supernatural phenomena, but rather profound manifestations of repressed memories given physical form through powerful psychic projection. The theory was both plausible and terrifying in equal measure. If correct, it meant that one of their own had become an unwitting conduit for warp energy. Such individuals were extraordinarily dangerous, capable of triggering demonic incursions or reality storms that could devastate entire planets. Imperial doctrine was unambiguous regarding the proper response to unsanctioned psychers. They were to be terminated immediately without trial or hesitation. But who among them had been chosen by the warp? The insidious symptoms affected everyone to some degree. All reported strange dreams and unsettling sensory disturbances. All had discovered personal items that simply should not exist. The corruption was not localized to a single individual, but had infected the entire squad like a spiritual contagion. Executing one person would accomplish nothing if the others remained compromised. Verin faced an impossible, soul-crushing choice. She could order the immediate execution of her entire command, including herself, to prevent the corruption from spreading beyond Ters 77 Alpha. This would be the grim decision of a by-the-book officer, meticulously trained to prioritize the Imperium's survival above individual lives. Alternatively, she could cling to the faint hope that the manifestations would simply fade with time, allowing her soldiers to eventually return to normal duty. This path, however, risked not only their immortal souls, but also the safety of every Imperial citizen in the sector. The decision was ultimately taken from her by events far beyond anyone's control. On the seventh night after their return from the crash site, the dead began to walk. The first horrifying sighting occurred during Voss's watch in the communication center. She was desperately attempting to restore the transmitter array when sudden movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. A figure stood silently in the doorway, starkly silhouetted against the corridor lighting. The shape was unmistakably human, yet profoundly wrong in ways that her mind struggled desperately to process. It was too tall, too thin, moving with jerky motions that resembled a marionette controlled by an inexperienced, clumsy puppeteer. She called out, expecting to receive an answer from one of her squad mates. Instead, the figure slowly turned toward her with a motion that involved far too many joints. In the space where a face should have been, there was only an utter darkness. Not the darkness of shadow or concealment, but an absence of light so complete that it seemed to actively devour the illumination around it. When it spoke, the voice belonged to someone who had been dead for 3 long years. "Petra," it said, using the exact inflection and accent of Corporal Jack Henna, killed during the evacuation of Hive Ters. "You left me behind." The accusation struck her with the force of a physical blow, tearing at old wounds. During the desperate retreat from the collapsing hive, she had indeed been forced to abandon wounded comrades who could not be evacuated. The decision had been tactically sound and, in the grim calculus of war, morally necessary. Carrying the injured would have slowed the entire squad, resulting in even more casualties. But sound tactics provided absolutely no comfort when the spectral faces of the abandoned continued to haunt her nightmares. She instinctively reached for her sidearm, training taking precedence over the surge of confusion and terror. The weapon cleared its holster in a motion practiced 10,000 times, muscle memory functioning flawlessly, even as her conscious mind reeled from the sheer impossibility of what she was witnessing. But before she could fire, the spectral figure dissolved like smoke touched by wind. Only empty air remained where the chilling apparition had stood moments before. Voss reported the incident immediately, using the station's internal Vox system to alert the entire squad. Her transmission was answered not by her living comrades, however, but by voices she instantly recognized as belonging to the dead. Names from the remembrance ceremony spoke from empty rooms, their spectral words carrying across frequencies that should have been secure. They offered eerie greetings, inquired about mutual friends, and even complained about conditions in whatever unimaginable realm they now inhabited. The chilling phenomenon spread throughout the facility with the terrifying speed of wildfire. In every corridor and chamber, the living encountered phantoms of those they had failed to save. The ghosts were not universally hostile. Many seemed genuinely pleased to renew contact with their former squadmates. They shared grim jokes, recalled shared experiences, and provided unsettling updates on their current circumstances that ranged from darkly amusing to deeply disturbing. Former Sergeant Mulk Theron, killed by Orc artillery on Coloss Prime, complained that death was boring as hell and casually asked if anyone had remembered to feed his pet groks back on Cadia. Trooper Elena Vask, who had died of infected wounds during the retreat from Mordax, wanted to know if her favorite low-stim brand was still available in the commissary. Private John Kell, grotesquely bisected by a Chaos Space Marines chainsword during the siege of Tyrock Fields, cheerfully reported that dismemberment was not as bad as you'd think once you got used to it. These conversations would have been deeply disturbing under any circumstances, but what made them utterly unbearable was their chilling accuracy. The dead possessed knowledge they simply should not have had. They knew intimate details about events that had occurred long after their deaths, about relationships that had developed in their absence, and about deeply personal details that had never been shared with anyone living. It was as if death had not separated them from the living, but had instead granted them a broader, more terrifying, a novel perspective on existence. Commander Harrow, the squad's medic, initially tried to rationalize these unsettling occurrences through medical reasoning. He considered the phenomenon of mass hallucinations, which were not unknown among soldiers enduring extreme stress. The human mind, he knew, possessed a remarkable capacity for self-deception, especially when confronted with guilt or trauma that overwhelmed its ability to process rationally. Therefore, what appeared to be supernatural visitations could potentially be explained as a collective psychological break, collectively triggered by their prolonged exposure to the chaos-tainted wreckage. However, the ghosts soon demonstrated a physical presence that extended far beyond mere visual manifestation. They could manipulate objects, leaving tangible evidence such as fingerprints on surfaces and expending ammunition from weapons they had no right to touch. Security recordings chillingly captured their movements, offering irrefutable proof that these apparitions existed independently of human perception. Whatever enigmatic force had brought them into being clearly operated according to rules that profoundly transcended mere psychology. The situation, predictably, deteriorated rapidly. Communication with the outside galaxy became impossible as the station's transmitter array began broadcasting the disembodied voices of the dead across every frequency. Supply deliveries abruptly ceased when dropship pilots reported hearing their own voices, eerily requesting permission to land, despite having transmitted no such requests themselves. Even more disturbing, the station's automated systems began inexplicably responding to commands issued by personnel who had been dead for years. Within a single week, Tertia 77 Alpha had transformed into a surreal monument to the permeable boundary between life and death. The living found themselves sharing their duties with the dead, working alongside phantoms who remembered their training with perfect, unnerving clarity. Guard rotations now included soldiers who cast no shadows, and equipment maintenance was performed by technicians whose spectral hands passed through solid matter at unpredictable intervals. This unsettling arrangement might have continued indefinitely if not for the unheralded arrival of new guests. They came without warning on a night when the aurora borealis painted the sky in magnificent shades of green and gold, a beautiful but ominous backdrop. Their approach was heralded not by the roar of engines or the crackle of Vox transmissions, but by the sudden, profound silence of the dead. One moment, the station bustled with the eerie activity of two squads, one living, one spectral, working in perfect synchronized coordination. The next, only the living remained, utterly alone in chambers that suddenly felt vast, cold, and achingly empty. The visitors announced themselves with a transmission that bypassed the station's communications array entirely, speaking directly into the minds of everyone present. The voice was warm and paternal, carrying unsettling undertones of infinite compassion and boundless wisdom. It offered greetings in the name of powerful entities that desired only humanity's enlightenment and prosperity. All that was required in exchange, the voice gently asserted, was a simple acknowledgement of their benevolent sovereignty over the material realm. Vin's response was immediate, visceral, and unambiguously defiant. She activated the station's emergency beacon without a second thought and ordered her squad to battle stations. The 47th Cadian Shock Troops had not survived decades of brutal warfare across 1,000 battlefields by accepting convenient offers from unknown, ostensibly benevolent entities. If these new visitors desired entry to Tertia 77 Alpha, they would have to take it by overwhelming force. The ensuing assault began not with kinetic weapons, but with psychological warfare designed to relentlessly undermine the defenders' resolve. The attackers projected terrifying images directly into human minds, showing each defender vivid visions of their deepest fears and, most shameful, hidden secrets. Vin saw herself as a terrified child, cowering in a crumbling bunker while Chaos Space Marines butchered her family. Fane, in his turn, experienced the harrowing trial of iron resolve once more. But this time, the coffin walls inexorably closed inward until they crushed his body to a bloody pulp. Each vision was crafted with malevolent precision to exploit personal vulnerabilities that no external observer should ever have known. Yet, the Cadians had been rigorously trained to resist precisely such psychic attacks. From childhood, they had practiced rigorous mental exercises designed to shield their thoughts from psychic intrusion. They recited litanies of hatred that focused their burning anger into weapons sharper than any blade. When fear threatened to overwhelm them, they consciously remembered the faces of fallen comrades who had died, their sacrifices hardening their resolve. Rather than submit to the enemy's insidious will, the Cadians stubbornly endured. The attackers, demonstrating disturbing adaptability, swiftly altered their strategy. Unable to break the defenders' minds through fear and torment, they began offering alluring rewards instead of punishment. Each Cadian was shown seductive visions of what they could become if they accepted the visitors' patronage. Enhanced strength that would make them unstoppable in combat. Perfect marksmanship that would never miss its target. Or medical knowledge that could resurrect the dead and heal any wound. These temptations, insidious and appealing, proved far more dangerous than any overt threat. Every soldier, deep down, dreamed of becoming something greater than human limitations typically allowed. The prospect of transcending mortality and achieving a form of perfection appealed to desires buried so deeply that most people never consciously acknowledged their existence. Several members of the squad, weary from their ordeal, began to waver, their resistance weakening perceptibly as they contemplated lives free from pain and failure. It was Dean, the squad's legendary marksman, who broke first. With the mechanical precision of a sleepwalker, he stepped away from his defensive position and walked toward the station's main entrance. His weapon remained clutched in his hands, but his finger had moved away from the trigger. When Vin, her voice tight with apprehension, called his name, he turned to face her with eyes that unnervingly reflected light like polished metal. "They're offering me my sight back," he said in a voice utterly devoid of emotion. "Perfect vision. I'll never miss again." The chilling simplicity of his statement revealed the profound depth of his private torment. Dean's legendary marksmanship, the very core of his identity, had been severely compromised by his earlier exposure to the chaos-tainted wreckage, reducing him from a precision instrument to merely competent. For a man whose entire existence was built upon superhuman accuracy, this loss was tantamount to a spiritual death. The visitors offered not just restoration, but enhancement beyond anything human genetics could ever achieve. Without hesitation, Vin raised her las pistol and shot him. The last bolt struck Dean squarely in the center of his chest, burning through his flak armor and stopping his heart instantly. He fell backward onto the station's cold metal flooring with the sickening sound of meat striking stone. For a fleeting moment, his expression registered surprise rather than pain, a flicker of comprehension. Then his eyes clouded over, and Marcus Dine, the finest marksman of the 47th Cadian Shock Troops, died as he had lived, serving the Emperor's will. The brutal execution served its grim purpose. Whatever insidious influence the visitors had exerted over Dine was immediately severed by his death. The remaining defenders felt the psychic pressure lessen, as if a crushing weight they had not even realized they were carrying had been abruptly lifted from their shoulders. However, the attackers, with their disturbing speed of adaptation, had undoubtedly learned valuable information about their opponent's capabilities and weaknesses. The second assault came without warning or any discernible preparation. One moment, the squad was maintaining defensive positions throughout the familiar confines of the station. The next, they found themselves disoriented and standing in a vast, impossible chamber that had not existed seconds before. The walls stretched upward, far beyond the reach of any illumination, disappearing into a darkness that seemed to possess both weight and substance. The floor beneath their feet was polished black stone, reflecting their images with perfect, unsettling clarity. At the very center of the chamber stood a figure that hurt the eye and mind to perceive directly. It wore the vague shape of a tall human, draped in robes that seemed to be cut from concentrated starlight. Where its face should have been, there was an abyssal void that contained swirling galaxies and dying suns. When it spoke, its voice carried the undeniable authority of creation itself. "Children of the corpse god," it intoned, each word causing reality to ripple around them like water disturbed by enormous thrown stones. "Your resistance is admirable, but ultimately pointless. Accept our gifts willingly and ascend beyond your mortal limitations. Refuse and be consumed by forces beyond your comprehension." The entity gestured with one hand, and Corvin screamed. Her body began to undergo a grotesque transformation, her flesh flowing like liquid as her limbs stretched and terrifyingly multiplied. Additional arms sprouted from her torso, each ending in hands that possessed too many fingers. Her face elongated into something monstrous, resembling a canine snout, complete with fangs that gleamed like polished obsidian. The transformation was not random or chaotic, but followed horrifying patterns that suggested intelligent, malevolent design. "Behold," the entity continued, its voice resonating through the impossible space, "the gift of perfection. Your comrade has been freed from the limitations of human form. She can now serve purposes far beyond the narrow scope of mortality." But Corvin, remarkably, was still Corvin. Despite the radical and agonizing alterations to her body, her mind remained intact, furious, and defiantly human. She raised one of her new arms, which now ended in wicked claws capable of rending ceramite, and made a gesture that would have gotten her executed for insubordination under any other circumstances. When she spoke, her voice was miraculously unchanged, despite the horrific transformation of her vocal cords. "Kiss my ass, you tentacled freak." The entity's response was immediate and terrible. Corvin's newly augmented body began to tear itself apart, each limb moving in a different, grotesque direction, with enough force to pulp bone and shred muscle. But instead of dying, she regenerated faster than the damage could accumulate. Flesh knitted itself back together even as it was being violently destroyed, creating a horrifying cycle of death and rebirth that could theoretically continue forever. This gruesome demonstration was clearly intended to break the remaining defenders' will. Instead, it had the precise opposite effect. Watching their comrade endure such unthinkable torture, the Cadians felt something far more powerful than fear or despair. They felt pure, undiluted rage, a seething hatred for enemies who would corrupt and torment rather than simply kill. This anger was not a weakness, but a potent strength, a purifying flame that burned away doubt and replaced it with crystalline, unyielding purpose. Harrow, the medic, moved first, launching himself at the cosmic entity with a surgical scalpel in each hand. These weapons were pathetically inadequate against a being of such power, but his suicidal attack served as a desperate catalyst for the others. Voss opened fire with her lasgun, sending coherent light streaming toward the figure's approximate center mass. Fane, with the precision of long practice, activated a frag grenade and hurled it with an accuracy that would have impressed even a space marine. Their combined assault accomplished nothing against the entity itself. Las bolts passed through its ethereal form without causing visible damage. The grenade exploded harmlessly against what appeared to be empty air. But their defiant actions had profound consequences that extended far beyond physical combat. The impossible chamber began to shake violently, its reality-defying walls cracking and groaning as natural law forcefully reasserted itself against the intrusion of alien logic. The entity let out a laugh, a sound like solar winds passing through the cold void between stars. But there was something forced and brittle about its amusement, as if the situation was not unfolding according to its meticulously laid plan. When it spoke again, its voice carried distinct undertones of frustration that had not been present before. "Your loyalty to a dead god is touching but utterly meaningless," it scoffed, attempting to sow discord. "The Emperor has abandoned you to die on a forgotten world, fighting enemies that will devour your souls and scatter your atoms across the void. What has such devotion earned you, except pain and solitude?" The question was deliberately meant to plant insidious seeds of doubt, designed to undermine their hard-won resistance. Instead, it only reminded the Cadians of the fundamental, unwavering truths that had guided their entire lives. They had never expected tangible rewards for their grueling service. They had never sought recognition or glory for their countless sacrifices. They fought not because victory was certain, but because defeat was utterly unthinkable. The Emperor protected them, not because he owed them protection, but because they had proven themselves worthy of his notice through endless suffering and unwavering faith. Vin stepped forward, her L-pistol trained steadily on the entity's approximate center mass. When she spoke, her voice carried the profound authority of someone who had never learned to doubt her purpose, her words ringing with conviction. "The Emperor protects," she declared, each word pronounced with the precision and fervor of a sacred prayer. "Not because we deserve it, not because we've earned it, but because we stand between humanity and the darkness. You can corrupt our flesh and torment our minds, but you cannot touch what makes us human. And as long as one of us draws breath, we will resist." The entity's cosmic laughter ceased abruptly. For the first time since its terrifying arrival, it seemed genuinely surprised, even taken aback, by their response. It had expected fear, desperation, or perhaps even a desperate attempt at bargaining. What it encountered instead was an implacable determination, backed by a faith that transcended all rational thought. These mere humans, it seemed to realize, would not be turned or broken because they had already sacrificed everything that could possibly be taken from them. The impossible chamber began to collapse around them, its alien architecture crumbling into dust as the entity's concentration faltered under the weight of their defiance. Reality forcefully reasserted itself with violent, shuddering force, snapping back into configurations that obeyed natural law. The Cadians found themselves once again in the familiar confines of Tersia 77 Alpha, surrounded by walls of honest concrete and solid ceramite, but they were no longer alone. The station was now filled with figures that glowed with a soft, ethereal golden light. These were not the unsettling ghosts of their fallen comrades, but something else entirely. Angels, perhaps, or the radiant spirits of saints who had died in the Emperor's service. They moved with an otherworldly purpose and grace, their very presence driving back the oppressive shadows that had never truly existed until that moment. Where they touched corrupted surfaces, a pristine purity instantly returned. Equipment that had long malfunctioned began operating normally, its internal mechanisms whirring to life. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere that had plagued the facility lifted like a dense fog, swiftly dispersed by morning sunlight. One of the luminous figures approached Vin, its golden light seeming to intensify in her presence. When it spoke, its voice carried overtones of serene authority that made the cosmic entity's earlier pronouncements seem like the petulant whimpering of spoiled children. Well done, faithful servants. Your unwavering resistance has been noted by those who keep eternal watch over humanity's defenders. The corruption that sought to claim this place has been purged, but vigilance must always be maintained. The enemy never truly sleeps, and neither can those who stand against it. The figure then gestured gently toward Corvin, whose grotesquely transformed body had been fully restored to its original, unblemished configuration. She stood exactly as she had before the entity's horrific intervention, her flesh unmarked by the tortures she had endured. Even her uniform had been miraculously repaired, showing no evidence of the violence that had been inflicted upon her. Yet, something in her eyes, a haunting depth, a distant, shadowed look, suggested that she remembered every agonizing moment of her ordeal with perfect, crystal clarity. "The wounded shall be made whole," the luminous being continued, its voice resonating with ancient power. "The corrupted shall be cleansed, but the price of purity is eternal vigilance. What you have witnessed here is but a shadow of the true darkness that waits beyond the light of Terra. Remember this night. Remember what you have seen. And never forget that the enemy's greatest victory is convincing humanity that it does not exist." As dawn approached, painting the distant horizon with soft hues, the angels began to fade, their forms becoming translucent before dissolving entirely into motes of light. But their benevolent presence left profound, lasting changes that would endure long after their departure. The station's equipment now functioned with an impossible efficiency that exceeded even factory specifications. The very walls themselves seemed to radiate a comforting warmth and security. Even the planet's harsh, frozen climate appeared to moderate, as if Coloss Prime had been touched by a divine benediction from distant Terra itself. In the days that followed, life at Tersia 77 Alpha gradually returned to patterns that superficially resembled normalcy. The communications array resumed its proper function, transmitting and receiving signals across the galaxy with crystalline clarity. Supply drops arrived precisely on schedule, bringing fresh rations and much-needed replacement equipment. The automated systems operated without malfunction or any lingering mystery, but the dead no longer walked the station's corridors. The familiar, comforting voices that had provided companionship and a strange form of solace were gone, leaving behind a silence that felt absolute and profoundly final. The living had been returned to their proper realm, separated from those who had passed beyond by boundaries that could not be crossed through will or desire alone. The squad conducted their remembrance ceremonies with a renewed, solemn gravity, knowing that the names they recited, belonged to souls who had finally found true peace in whatever realm awaited the faithful. Vin, with the same mechanical precision she brought to all administrative duties, filed her official report. The carefully crafted record stated that the 47th Cadian Shock Troops had investigated a crashed Imperial vessel, discovered undeniable evidence of chaos corruption, and implemented appropriate containment procedures. The supernatural manifestations were conveniently classified as stress-induced hallucinations brought on by prolonged exposure to warp-tainted materials. The entity's terrifying appearance was meticulously described as a shared psychotic episode, tragically triggered by prolonged isolation and severe combat fatigue. The report was, unsurprisingly, accepted without question by high-ranking officers who had never set foot on a battlefield in their lives, then promptly filed away in archives that would likely never be examined by anyone with the authority or inclination to act upon its extraordinary contents. It was added to the vast, sprawling accumulation of documentation that formed the Imperium's institutional memory. Another inconvenient incident processed and forgotten by minds that demonstrably preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable, existential truths. 3 months later, a new assignment arrived via encrypted transmission. The 47th Cadian Shock Troops were to be transferred to Agri-World Data 3, where Orc raiders had been conducting nuisance strikes against vital food production facilities. The deployment would require a 6-month journey through the treacherous warp space, followed by an indefinite period of garrison duty on a world where the primary threats were feral groks and mundane equipment failures. The squad prepared for transfer with the same methodical, disciplined approach they brought to all military operations. Equipment was painstakingly cleaned, thoroughly inspected, and meticulously packed according to regulations that had been refined through centuries of imperial expansion. Personal effects were secured in reinforced containers designed to survive void ship emergencies. Final maintenance checks were performed on systems that would continue operating long after their departure. On their last night at Tertia 77 Alpha, the squad gathered in the common room for a final, poignant remembrance ceremony. The solemn list of names had grown by one, Marcus Dean, the finest marksman of the 47th Cadian Shock Troops, who had died serving the Emperor's will. His name was added to the litany with the same reverence accorded to every fallen comrade, spoken aloud so that his sacrifice would never be forgotten. As they recited the familiar sacred words, something subtle shifted in the air around them. It was not the oppressive, menacing presence they had felt during the entity's visit, but something gentler, almost familiar. For just a fleeting moment, they could have sworn they heard additional voices, faint and ethereal, joining their ceremony. Phantom sounds that might have been the wind sighing through ventilation ducts or the settling of cooling metal, but sounds that uncannily resembled human speech shaped into words of remembrance and farewell. But when they strained to listen more carefully, there was only the absolute silence of the empty station. The transport arrived at dawn, its ancient hull scarred by decades of tireless service in the Emperor's fleets. The pilot was a grizzled veteran who had seen enough horrors on enough worlds to know precisely when not to ask questions. He accepted the squad's gear without comment and provided them with worn acceleration couches that showed the deep wear of countless previous passengers. The departure was routine, unremarkable, and efficiently executed. As Coloss Prime fell away beneath them, Vin watched through a viewport until the planet became just another glittering star in the vast, indifferent constellation of Imperial worlds. Somewhere on its frozen surface, Tertia 77 Alpha continued its automated functions, diligently maintaining equipment that no longer served any true purpose. The communications array transmitted its signals into a void that had no one left to answer. The defensive positions remained alert for enemies that would never come. She wondered if the station itself remembered them, if buildings could somehow retain impressions of those who had lived and died within their solid walls, if the very stones bore silent witness to acts of courage and sacrifice that would never be recorded in any official history. Such thoughts, she knew, were superstitious nonsense, entirely unbefitting a rational soldier of the Imperial Guard. Yet, she could not shake the persistent feeling that They had left something profoundly important behind on that forsaken, frozen world. The journey to Data Threath passed without incident, a fact that was, in itself, unsettling. The Geller field held steady through warp translations that should have sorely tested even veteran crews. The ship's systems functioned with a reliability that impressed even the notoriously demanding tech priests responsible for their maintenance. Morale remained unusually high among the passengers who had braced themselves for a voyage filled with the usual terrifying hazards of warp travel. Too high, perhaps. Too convenient. Too perfect in every measurable detail. During the third week of their journey, Commander Harrow began conducting routine medical examinations that soon revealed disturbing, anomalous patterns. Every member of the squad showed undeniable signs of cellular regeneration that profoundly exceeded normal human parameters. Wounds that should have left permanent, disfiguring scars had healed without a trace. Dental work performed years earlier had been restored to perfect condition, as if time itself had been rewound. Even genetic markers associated with aging had been reversed, or, in some cases, entirely eliminated. The changes were subtle enough to escape casual observation, but profound enough to suggest fundamental alterations to their biological nature. They were still human in every way that mattered, but they had become something more than human limitations typically allowed. Stronger, faster, more resilient to damage and disease. They were enhanced in ways that should have required decades of surgical modification or complex genetic therapy. When confronted with the compelling evidence, none of them could consciously remember when these miraculous improvements had begun. The changes felt entirely natural, as if they had always possessed these enhanced capabilities. Their accelerated reflexes and improved endurance seemed like recovered memories rather than new acquisitions. It was only through careful comparison with their old medical records that the profound alterations became undeniably apparent. Corvin, while performing routine equipment maintenance, discovered additional, equally unsettling modifications. Her hands had developed an extraordinary sensitivity to electromagnetic fields that allowed her to diagnose complex mechanical problems through touch alone. She could feel the subtle flow of current through circuits and detect minute metal fatigue long before it became visible to conventional inspection. These abilities were far beyond anything that normal human senses could possibly achieve. Voss, meanwhile, found that her aim had inexplicably improved to levels that approached, if not surpassed, Dini's legendary marksmanship. She could place shots with a precision that defied statistical probability, threading bullets through gaps that should have been impossible to hit. Her reflexes had accelerated to the point where she could track individual raindrops during heavy, driving storms. Most disturbing of all was Tyne's discovery that he could now sense the emotional states of those around him. This was not achieved through mere observation of facial expressions or body language, but through some direct internal form of perception that bypassed his normal senses entirely. He could feel Vin's unyielding determination as a physical weight in his chest, taste Harrow's sharp curiosity like metal on his tongue, and smell the lingering, acrid traces of fear that clung to all of them like smoke. These enhancements were clearly not random mutations, but purposeful modifications, meticulously designed to make them more effective soldiers. Someone, or something, had improved their capabilities while meticulously leaving their fundamental humanity intact. The pressing question was whether this astonishing transformation was a reward for their faithful service or a chilling preparation for trials that would inevitably require abilities far beyond normal human limits. The answer, when it finally came, arrived during their final week of warp travel, when the ship's advanced sensors detected an anomaly that by all laws of physics and common sense should not have existed. Long-range Auspex readings showed a massive object moving through the void at speeds that flagrantly violated known laws of physics. The signature was utterly unlike anything in Imperial databases, strongly suggesting technology that originated from sources far beyond human understanding. The captain, his face grim, immediately ordered evasive maneuvers, but the colossal entity matched their frantic course changes with effortless ease. It approached the transport with the deliberate, chilling patience of a predator stalking wounded prey. When it finally revealed itself on the visual scanners, the bridge crew fell into a stunned, horrified silence, recognizing something that belonged firmly in nightmare rather than reality. The thing was vast beyond easy comprehension, its monstrous hull stretching across distances that should have housed entire cities. Its surface was covered with grotesque growths that pulsed with complex bioluminescent patterns, too intricate and disturbing for human minds to fully process. Sensor readings suggested that it was simultaneously organic and mechanical, as if some ancient, malevolent intelligence had merged living flesh with cold technology to create hybrid abominations of unspeakable horror. But most terrifying of all was the sudden, dawning realization that the entity was not alone. Long-range sensors detected additional contacts, scores of them, moving through the void in formations that clearly suggested intelligence and a singular, terrifying purpose. They were heading relentlessly toward Imperial space with the methodical determination of an invasion fleet. Their estimated time of arrival at the nearest inhabited system measured in mere months rather than years. The transport's captain made the only decision available to him in that desperate moment. He ordered an immediate translation back to real space and transmitted a priority emergency signal to the nearest Imperial facility. The warning, he knew, would take weeks to reach its distant destination. But it might, provide enough advance notice for defensive preparations. At best, the Imperium would have precious time to evacuate civilian populations and position military assets where they could inflict maximum damage on the approaching enemy. At worst, the warning would be tragically ignored by high-ranking officers who, entrenched in their dogma, simply refused to believe reports that fundamentally contradicted their comfortable understanding of reality. The 47th Cadian Shock Troops ultimately reached Data 3 without further incident. They were assigned to garrison duty at a military depot that protected vital food shipments bound for nearby hive worlds. Their duties were routine and seemingly undemanding, involving nothing more dangerous than preventing petty theft by local wildlife and maintaining equipment that rarely required significant attention. But their nights, despite the mundane duties of the day, were increasingly filled with vivid dreams that felt more like deeply etched memories. Visions of battles fought on worlds that had not yet been discovered, glimpses of terrifying enemies that wore shapes borrowed directly from humanity's deepest primal fears and darkest nightmares. Fears. They harbored premonitions of a conflict so cataclysmic it would render their past campaigns mere insignificant skirmishes by comparison. By day, they executed their assigned duties with chilling mechanical precision. But when darkness fell, their minds wrestled with preparations for battles that, for now, materialized only in the collective terror of their shared nightmares. They meticulously cleaned weapons, knowing deep down these instruments of war might never be unleashed in anger on this seemingly tranquil world. They drilled tirelessly, honing tactics devised for adversaries yet to take corporeal form. Their readiness for deployment remained absolute, a state of perpetual anticipation for orders that perhaps would never arrive. Meanwhile, the subtle, insidious modifications to their very physiology continued to unfold. Their enhanced healing capabilities stitched wounds shut without a trace, erasing all scars. Improved reflexes rendered even the most demanding routine tasks feel painfully sluggish. Their new speed a constant, unsettling presence. Their senses had sharpened to an almost preternatural degree, bordering on true precognition. They were undeniably transforming into something transcending mere humanity. Yet this radical transformation felt less like evolution and more like a profound regression, as if they were reclaiming dormant capabilities humanity had once wielded, only to have forgotten them through ages of disuse. Exactly 6 months into their deployment, Verin received new orders, delivered through a heavily classified transmission. The command detailed the immediate reassignment of the 47th Cadian Shock Troops to a facility whose very location was classified well above her security clearance. Their transportation would be arranged by vessels operating under the direct, unquestionable authority of the Inquisition. All existing duties were to be swiftly transferred to incoming replacement personnel within a mere 72 hours. The orders bore the signatures of authorities Verin had never encountered, sealed with emblems that radiated an undeniable power, far surpassing anything in her military experience. This was no routine military transfer. It was a summons of far greater, more ominous significance. They were being summoned by entities operating deep within the shadows, beyond the conventional reach of the vast imperial hierarchy. As preparations for their departure accelerated, Harrow unearthed a final, chilling discovery that cast their entire predicament in a horrifying new light. Buried deep within their supposedly routine medical files were genetic markers, anomalous sequences that had no place within baseline human DNA. These sequences bore the unmistakable hallmarks of deliberate coding rather than the organic progression of natural evolution. Such patterns unequivocally suggested that their bodily modifications had been meticulously planned and surgically implemented by an intelligence possessing a grasp of human biology vastly superior to anything known within imperial medical science. They were no longer merely enhanced soldiers. They were prototypes of something entirely new, living experiments meticulously designed to probe and push the very limits of human potential. The terrifying question remained: had they been improved for their own benefit, or to serve inscrutable purposes existing far beyond their limited comprehension? The answer, they knew, would soon reveal itself. The galaxy itself was undergoing a profound, tumultuous metamorphosis, demanding that humanity either swiftly evolve or face an inevitable, horrifying extinction. Ancient, unspeakable threats were stirring from their long slumber within the cold void between stars, poised to reclaim territories they had abandoned aeons past. The impending war, unlike any before, would not merely be fought between opposing armies, but rather between fundamentally divergent concepts of what life itself was destined to become. And in the oppressive darkness, hovering in the liminal space between true sleep and full waking, Vin could distinctly hear something calling her name, not with the spectral voices of the dead nor the insidious whispers of corruption, but with words that resonated with the crushing weight of absolute cosmic authority. These were commands issued by entities that transcended the very boundaries of time and space, beings of inconceivable power, instructions for battles that would not merely decide skirmishes, but the very existence, the ultimate future of humanity itself. She closed her eyes tighter, listening intently to sounds that seemed to emanate from nowhere, from everywhere, prepared for a deployment to places utterly nameless, ready to confront enemies who might wear familiar faces but whose very souls were carved from the deepest, most terrifying alien nightmares. The Emperor protects, she silently reminded herself, clinging to the ancient litany as the abyss of sleep finally claimed her. Yet, even the mighty Emperor's protection might prove insufficient against threats that festered not from without, but from within humanity's own evolving core. In her troubled dreams, she saw Cadia aflame once more, but this time it was not merely succumbing to an external invasion. It was morphing, twisting, transforming into something monstrous, something that had utterly ceased to be human at all.